Okay, kids, today I'm reading chapter 13 and of Stuart Little, Ames Crossing. In the loveliest town of all, where the houses were white and high and the elm trees were green and higher than the houses, where the front yards were wide and pleasant and the backyards were bushy and worth finding out about, where the streets sloped down to the stream and the stream flowed quietly under the bridge, where the lawns ended in orchards and the orchards ended in fields and the fields ended in pastures, and the pastures climbed the hill and disappeared over the top toward the wonderful wide sky. In this loveliest of all towns, Stuart stopped to get a drink of sarsaparilla. Parking his car in front of the general store, he stepped out, and the sun felt so good he sat down on the porch for a few moments to enjoy the feeling of being in a new place on a fine day. This was the most peaceful and beautiful spot he had found in all his travels. It seemed a place he could spend the rest of his life in if he weren't sure that he would be homesick for the sights of New York and for his family, Mr. and Mrs. Little and George. He didn't miss Snowbell, of course. And if it weren't for the fact that something deep inside him made him want to find Margalo. Remember, he's looking for Margalo. She's gone, and he's searching for her. After a while, a storekeeper came out and joined Stuart on the front steps. Okay, so here's a picture. He's in this little town, and you see when this book was written, uh, this building is made of wood. So we know that this is from a long time ago. And so they're sitting on the front wooden steps. Have you got any sarsaparilla in your store? Asked Stuart. I've got a ruinous thirst. That's a drink that they used to have available a long time ago. Certainly, said the storekeeper, gallons of it. All kinds of drinks: Coca Cola, Pepsi, Dipsy Cola, Pepsi Cola, Popsy Cola, and raspberry cream tonic. Anything you want. Let me have a bottle of sarsaparilla, please, said Stuart, and a paper cup. The storekeeper went back in the store and returned with a drink. He opened the bottle, poured some out into the cup, and set the cup down on the step below Stuart, who whipped off his cap, lay down on his stomach, and dipped up some of the cool, refreshing drink, using his cap as a dipper. So here's a picture, and the cup looks huge. It looks taller than Stuart. He's having to use his hat to dip in here to get a drink. That's very refreshing, remarked Stuart. There's nothing like a long, cool drink in the heat of the day when you're traveling. Are you going far? Asked the storekeeper. Perhaps very far, replied Stuart. I'm looking for a bird named Margalo. You haven't seen her, have you? Can't say I have, said the storekeeper. What does she look like? Perfectly beautiful, replied Stuart, wiping the drink off his lips with the corner of his sleeve. She's remarkable. Anyone would notice her. She comes from a place where there are thistles. The storekeeper looked at Stuart. How tall are you? 2 inches, nothing and a quarter, answered Stuart. I haven't been measured recently, however. I may have grown a little bit. You know, there's somebody in this town you really ought to meet. Who's that? Asked Stuart, yawning. Harriet Ames, said the storekeeper. She's just your size, maybe even a little bit shorter. What's she like? Asked Stuart. Fair, fat, and 40? No, Harriet is young and she's quite pretty. She's considered one of the best dressed girls in this town, too. All her clothes are made special for her. That's so, remarked Stuart. Yes, Harriet's quite a girl. Her people, the Ameses, are rather prominent in this town. One of her ancestors used to be the ferryman here in Revolutionary days. He would carry anybody across the stream. He didn't care whether they were British soldiers or American soldiers as long as they paid their money. I guess he did pretty well. Anyway, the Ameses have always had a lot of money. They live in a big house with a lot of people who work for them. I know Harriet would be very interested to meet you. That's very kind of you, replied Stuart, but I'm not much of a society man these days. Too much on the move. I never stay long anywhere. I blow into town and blow right out again. The highways and byways are where you'll find me, always looking for Margalo. Sometimes I feel I'm quite close to her, that she's just around the turn of the road. Other times I feel like I'll never find her. Which reminds me, it's time I was on my way. Stuart paid for his drink, said goodbye to the storekeeper, and drove off. But Ames Crossing seemed like the finest town he'd ever known, and before he reached the end of the main street, he took a left onto a dirt road and drove down to a quiet spot by the bank of the river. That afternoon he swam and lay on his back on the mossy bank, his hands crossed under his head, his thoughts returning to the conversation he had had with the storekeeper. Harriet Ames, he murmured. Evening came, and Stuart still lingered by the stream. He ate a light supper of cheese sandwich and a drink of water, and he slept that night in the grass. And here's a picture of him by the river, and he's kind of having his own little picnic here by the river, and he's enjoying the sights and sounds of this little town. In the morning, the sun rose warm and bright, and Stuart slipped into the river again for an early dip. After breakfast, he left his car hidden under a skunk cabbage leaf and walked up to the post office. While he was filling his fountain pen from the public ink well, he happened to glance toward the door, and what he saw startled him so much he almost fell down. A girl about 2 inches high had entered, and she was crossing the floor toward the mailboxes. In her hair was a tiny flower. Stuart began to tremble from excitement. Must be the Ames girl, he said to himself, and he kept hidden behind the inkwell as he watched her open her mailbox, which was about a quarter of an inch wide, very small, and pull out her letters. The storekeeper had told the truth. She was very pretty, and of course she was the only girl Stuart had ever encountered who wasn't miles and miles taller than he was. He thought that if the two of them were to walk along together, her head would come a little higher than his shoulder. This idea filled him with interest. He wanted to talk to her, but he didn't dare. He felt kind of shy, so he waited until she left. All right, so here's the inkwell. Before fountain pens had ink in them, you'd have to dip them in the inkwell and fill them up. And here is Harriet. You see how tiny she is. She's just Stuart's about the same height as Stuart, about 2 inches. When he was sure that she was gone, he stole out of the post office and slunk down the street to the store, half hoping he'd meet this beautiful little girl, half fearing that he would. Do you have any engraved stationery? He asked the storekeeper. I'm behind on my correspondence. He wants to write a letter. The storekeeper helped Stuart up onto the counter and found some letter paper for him, small paper marked with the initial L. Stuart whipped out his fountain pen and sat down against a 5-cent candy bar and began a letter to Harriet. And here's a picture. Now, when this book was written, candy bars are only 5 cents. That's a lot different from today, isn't it? My dear Miss Ames, he wrote, I'm a young person of modest proportions. By birth, I'm a New Yorker, but at the moment I'm traveling on business of a confidential nature. My travels have brought me to your village. Yesterday, the keeper of your local store, who has an honest face and an open manner, gave me a most favorable report of your character and appearance. At this point in the letter, Stuart's pen ran dry from the long words, and he had to get the storekeeper to lower him head first into the bottle of ink so he could refill his pen. Then he went back to letter writing. And here's the storekeeper holding Stuart upside down so he can reach the ink and fill his pen up again. Please forgive me, Miss Ames, continued Stuart, for presuming to strike up an acquaintance on so slender as an excuse as your physical similarity, but of course the fact is there are very few people who are only 2 inches tall. Actually, I may be a little taller than that. The only thing is I look like a mouse. I'm nicely proportioned, however, and I have lots of muscles. Let me be perfectly blunt. My purpose in writing this note is to suggest that we meet. I realize that your parents may not want me to meet you, as well as my mouse-like appearance, so I think it might be a good idea if you just didn't mention that to them. What they don't know won't hurt them. However, you probably understand more about dealing with your father and mother than I do, but I will leave it to your good judgment. Being an outdoors person, I'm camped by the river in an attractive spot. Would you like to go for a paddle ride with me in my canoe? How about tomorrow afternoon toward sundown? These tranquil spring evenings are designed by special architects for the enjoyment of boatmen. I love the water, dear Miss Ames, and my canoe is like an old and trusted friend. Stuart forgot when he's writing his letter that he didn't even own a canoe. So how's he going to take this girl riding in a canoe if he doesn't even own one? And he signed the letter, yours very truly, Stuart Little. After he sealed his letter in an envelope, he turned to the storekeeper. Where can I get a canoe? Right here, replied the storekeeper. He walked over to the souvenir counter and took down a little canoe with the words Summer Memories stamped on the side. Stuart examined it closely. Does she leak? It's a nice canoe, said the storekeeper. It will cost you 75 cents plus a penny tax. Stuart took out his money and paid the man. Then he looked inside the canoe and noticed there were no paddles. What about paddles? He said. The storekeeper hunted all around the souvenirs, but he couldn't find any paddles. So he went over to the ice cream counter and came back with two little cardboard spoons, those little tiny spoons that come with ice cream. These will work out all right as paddles. Stuart took the spoons, but he didn't like the way that they looked. This may work out all right, but I would hate to meet an American Indian while I have one of these things in my hand. The storekeeper carried the canoe and the paddles out in front of the store and set them down in the street. He wondered what this tiny boatman would do next, but Stuart never hesitated. Taking a piece of thread from his pocket, he lashed the paddles to the thwarts, swung the canoe lightly up on his head, and walked off with it as calmly as though he were a Canadian guide. He was very, very proud of his ability with boats, and he liked to show off. And here's a picture. Stuart is carrying the canoe, and he's going down to the river because he wants to ride in the canoe, sail in the canoe with Harriet the next day. What do you think? Is she going to show up? Will she come and meet Stuart? What will happen next? Is he going to give up on Margalo? You'll have to tune in and find out. Bye, guys.